a quiet village. A scream by the river, and a body at the old mill. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing our mystery circle grow. Your comments make every case come alive. Now, the murder at the old mill. The sun was warm that Saturday afternoon, casting a golden glow across the neatly trimmed lawns of the old mill house. Once a working mill, the building had been converted into a handsome country residence, complete with ivy crawling up its stone walls and a bubbling stream at the back where children often dangled their legs in summer. On this particular day, the grounds were alive with laughter and chatter. Mrs. Penelope Harcourt, the proud new owner of the old mill, was hosting a garden party, a gesture of goodwill, as she called it, to settle herself into village life. Tea tables were spread across the lawn, covered with lace cloths, dainty sandwiches, and a particularly large sponge cake that seemed to be the object of every child's ambition. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her pale lavender hat and carrying a delicate parasol, sat quietly at one of the tables. She was not one to miss such events. After all, village gatherings revealed more about human nature than most people realized. To the casual eye, she was simply enjoying her tea. In reality, her keen eyes missed little. The nervous way Mrs. Harcourt's maid glanced toward the house, the tight smile exchanged between Colonel Halford and Mrs. Ellison, and the rather pointed avoidance with which young Peter Bloxham kept away from his employer's daughter. As the clock struck 4, Mrs. Harcourt raised her glass of sherry to make a small speech of welcome. The villagers clapped politely, and conversation resumed. It was only moments later, as the vicar's wife reached for a scone, that a piercing scream shattered the tranquility. The sound had come from inside the house. Chairs scraped against the lawn as people rushed toward the source. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered in the hall of the old mill. Lying at the foot of the grand staircase was Mr. Arthur Harcourt, Penelope's husband, his face ghastly pale, his body sprawled at an unnatural angle. "Good heavens," Colonel Halford muttered, kneeling to check for a pulse. After a pause that stretched uncomfortably long, he shook his head gravely. A hush fell across the hall. Teacups were abandoned, conversations silenced. A garden party had become, in the blink of an eye, the scene of a tragedy. Miss Marple, having arrived a little slower than the rest, quietly observed the scene. While others gasped and whispered, her eyes lingered not on the body but on the expressions of those around her. Panic, shock, grief, and on one face in particular something far less natural. It was then that Miss Marple knew this was no unfortunate accident. This was murder. Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The village reacts, where gossip spreads and the first speculative theories emerge. Or would you like to pause here and refine the cast of characters together before moving further? The villagers of St. Mary Mead had always prided themselves on their ability to keep calm in the face of the unexpected. But within an hour of Arthur Harcourt's body being discovered, the village was humming with speculation and scandal like a disturbed beehive. By the time the local constable arrived, red-faced and puffing with importance, gossip had already spread from the lawns of the old mill to the post office, the vicarage, and the neat row of cottages along the high street. Those who had not attended the garden party found themselves besieged with urgent whispers from those who had. A single scream had become, through the embellishment of eager tongues, 3 screams. Arthur Harcourt's tumble had grown from a slip on a stair to an apparent push, or even, as Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, insisted, a violent shove by unseen hands. Inside the old mill, the mood was strained and unsettled. Mrs. Harcourt had been ushered into the drawing-room by her maid, her cheeks pale beneath her rouge, and her handkerchief clutched dramatically against her lips. She was, to her credit, maintaining composure, though Miss Marple noted the sharp glitter in her eyes whenever someone mentioned her late husband's name. The Colonel stood stiffly by the window, his jaw clenched, while Mrs. Ellison fanned herself with unnecessary vigor, as though in great danger of swooning. Young Peter Bloxam was cornered by two ladies, answering their eager questions with muttered replies and visible irritation. The constable cleared his throat importantly, drawing himself up to his full height. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice quivering slightly as it attempted authority, "I must ask you all to remain calm. The doctor has been sent for, and we shall soon know the cause of this tragedy." Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively by a small side table laden with abandoned teacups, murmured softly, "Oh, I dare say the cause is already apparent, if one only looks in the right direction." Her comment went largely unnoticed, drowned beneath the buzz of conversation, but Mrs. Ellison nearest to her blinked and leaned in. "What was that, Miss Marple? You don't think it was merely an accident?" Miss Marple smiled politely, her eyes crinkling. "Accidents are rarer than people suppose, my dear. In my experience, one finds that a stumble is very often encouraged." Mrs. Ellison gasped, clutching her pearls in a most satisfactory manner, and hurried to repeat Miss Marple's words to Mrs. Price, who wasted no time in telling Mrs. Calthorpe, who in turn whispered it with relish to the vicar's wife. Thus, in the span of moments, the entire assembly had shifted from the notion of accident to certainty of murder. It was into this atmosphere of suspicion that Inspector Graves finally arrived from the nearby town. A tall man with thinning hair and an expression of perpetual irritation, he looked at the gathering as though he had walked into a classroom of unruly children. "Now then," he barked, "no need for this chatter. We'll have order here." His eyes swept the room and landed on the body still lying in the hall, now respectfully covered with a sheet. "Until the doctor confirms, we shall treat this as an unfortunate accident. Nothing more, nothing less." At this, several villagers exchanged glances, but no one dared argue openly. Only Miss Marple tilted her head, studying the inspector with the air of a schoolmistress watching a pupil make a predictable mistake. She observed quietly as Graves began to take statements. Colonel Halford was the first to speak, his voice brusque. "I saw the poor fellow at the top of the stairs not a moment before it happened. He looked perfectly steady, no sign of dizziness. Then, next thing, he was tumbling down like a sack of coal. Strange thing, if you ask me." "Quite so, Colonel," the inspector said, scribbling. "And you saw no one else nearby?" The colonel hesitated, then glanced toward Mrs. Ellison before answering. "No, no one at all." Mrs. Ellison gave a small sniff, though her fan fluttered faster. Miss Marple, who noticed such little betrayals as naturally as breathing, made a mental note. Peter Bloxam's account was briefer still. "Didn't see anything. I was outside with the others." His voice carried a hint of irritation, but also, Miss Marple thought, of relief, as though he were glad to be away from the scene, yet anxious all the same. Mrs. Harcourt's testimony was the most dramatic, her voice trembling as she dabbed delicately at her eyes. Arthur had been in fine spirits all morning. He had even complimented my arrangements, Inspector. She looked around as though daring someone to contradict her. Then he excused himself, saying he had forgotten a paper in his study. The next I knew, there was that dreadful scream. "Oh, Inspector, how am I to go on?" "Very good, madam," Graves said, not unkindly. "We'll do everything necessary." He turned to the maid, a pale, thin girl named Alice, who wrung her hands as she spoke. I heard voices upstairs, sir. Not Mr. Harcourt's alone. I couldn't make out what was said, but it sounded sharp like a quarrel, maybe." At this, a ripple of excitement stirred through the room. Graves raised a hand. "Enough. Until we have proof, there's no need to spread tales." But the tales had already begun. Within the hour, the village had produced half a dozen theories. Mr. Harcourt had quarrelled with his wife over money. He had quarrelled with young Peter over some undisclosed matter. He had even, according to Mrs. Price's more elaborate version, been overheard quarrelling with himself, a certain sign of madness. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat serenely by the hearth, her knitting emerging from the depths of her bag, with the calm inevitability of the tide. She listened without appearing to, her needles clicking softly as she pieced together the scraps of conversation. To the inspector, it might have looked like harmless old lady gossip. To Miss Marple, it was the steady accumulation of human truth. When at last the doctor arrived and confirmed what she had suspected, that Arthur Harcourt's neck had been broken instantly, the angle suggesting force rather than accident, the inspector's irritation deepened. "Very well," he declared. "We shall proceed as though foul play is involved. But mark my words, it will likely prove to be nothing more than a tragic fall after all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. She thought of the maid's words about raised voices, of Mrs. Ellison's sudden fluttering when the Colonel spoke, of Mrs. Harcourt's carefully displayed grief, and of Peter Bloxam's taut nerves. Yes, she thought, there was more to this than met the eye. Much more. Outside, the evening shadows lengthened, and the garden party lay abandoned, its cakes uneaten, its flowers wilting in the late sun. St. Mary Mead, so accustomed to its quiet routines, had been shaken into turbulence. By the time the villagers returned to their homes, lanterns glowing in cottage windows and curtains drawn against the dark, the story of the murder at the old mill had become the sole topic of conversation, and in a small, neat sitting room across the lane, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, the faint smile of someone who already glimpsed the edges of truth upon her lips. Human nature, she mused, was the same in St. Mary Mead as it was in London, in Paris, or in any corner of the world. One had only to look closely enough, but for now she would let the others chatter, blunder, and suspect. The truth had a way of ripening slowly, like fruit on a tree, and Miss Marple, with infinite patience, was always ready to wait for the right moment to pluck it. That evening, as the lamps were lit across St. Mary Mead, and supper was served in its quiet cottages, the Harcourt tragedy remained the sole subject on every tongue. The chatter at the Rose and Crown grew particularly animated. Men leaned on the bar, voices low but urgent, speculating on who might have pushed poor Arthur Harcourt down the stairs. Theories multiplied with every pint of ale poured. Some insisted it was nothing more than an accident, yet most agreed the circumstances were altogether too peculiar. What possible reason had Arthur to wander upstairs during his wife's garden party? And why had voices been heard raised in quarrel? Miss Marple, who had walked home from the old mill with her customary gentle pace, heard snippets of these conversations carried on the evening air. She allowed herself a faint smile at the certainty with which people always assumed their version of events was the true one. In her experience, the first explanations offered in such cases were rarely more than reflections of each speaker's own prejudices. Mrs. Price, who disliked Mrs. Harcourt's fashionable airs, was convinced the wife had done it. The Colonel, who had no patience for young hotheads, muttered darkly about Peter Bloxam. And Mrs. Ellison, whose nerves trembled at the thought of violence, was already half convinced the entire affair had been the act of some wandering tramp, though no such person had been seen near the village in months. The following morning brought more clarity, at least in official terms. Inspector Graves had stationed a constable at the old mill and taken himself to the Harcourt study, where Arthur's papers lay scattered. Rumour quickly spread that business troubles were suspected. Miss Marple, on her way to the grocer's, was stopped no fewer than 3 times by anxious neighbours, eager to tell her what they had heard on good authority. At the shop, Mrs. Calthorpe whispered over the butter slab, "They say Mr. Harcourt had debts, dreadful ones. A man came down from London not a fortnight ago, and there was some unpleasantness." Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, replied mildly, "Oh, indeed. Money does have a way of upsetting tempers, though not always in the directions one expects." She did not add that she remembered the maid's testimony of raised voices, nor that she had observed the peculiar stiffness between Colonel Halford and Mrs. Ellison. Human quarrels were rarely about only one thing. Later that day, Inspector Graves returned to the old mill to interview Penelope Harcourt again, and Miss Marple, under the pretence of delivering a jar of homemade jam as a gesture of sympathy, found herself welcomed into the drawing room at the same time. Mrs. Harcourt, her eyes still rimmed in black from weeping, but her poise intact, accepted the jar with a gracious word. "I cannot imagine what people must be saying," she murmured, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Arthur was not perfect, but he did not deserve such an end. And now my name is being dragged into gossip, as though I could ever—" She let the thought trail away with an artful sob. Inspector Graves coughed. "You understand, madam, that in cases such as these the immediate family must be questioned most thoroughly. It is procedure, nothing more." Mrs. Harcourt inclined her head, a picture of dignity. "Of course, Inspector. I have nothing to hide. My husband and I had our differences, but what married couple does not?" Miss Marple, her knitting now conveniently in hand, looked up with gentle curiosity. "I expect you managed as most do, Mrs. Harcourt. A few sharp words here and there, but always mended over with civility." Something flickered in Penelope Harcourt's eyes, quickly masked by a wan smile. "Precisely, Miss Marple. You understand so well." The inspector, who had less patience for subtleties, pressed on with his questions. Had she quarrelled with her husband recently? Who had last spoken to him? And whether she could think of anyone with a motive to do him harm? Her answers were calm and polished, but to Miss Marple's ear they had the hollow ring of rehearsed lines. It was not what Mrs. Harcourt said that interested her, but what she left unsaid. Later, in the lane outside the old mill, Miss Marple encountered Alice, the maid, carrying a basket of linens. The girl looked pale and flustered, and at the sight of Miss Marple she hesitated, then blurted out, "I shouldn't say nothing, ma'am, but I can't keep it in. It weren't just voices I heard yesterday. There was a name said too." Miss Marple lowered her voice kindly. "A name, my dear?" "Yes, ma'am." Plain as anything, Mr. Harcourt said, "You'll not make a fool of me, Halford." Alice bit her lip. "I thought maybe I was mistaken, but I don't think so." And then, right after, the scream came. Miss Marple thanked her gently and urged her to speak only to the inspector, if asked directly. But as she walked away, she reflected with satisfaction that her earlier observations were beginning to align. The Colonel's stiffness, Mrs. Ellison's fluttering nervousness, yes, a quarrel with Halford fit neatly into the pattern. That evening the village was alive with whispers of this new detail. By supper-time the Colonel was being pointed at discreetly in the street, and Mrs. Ellison had taken to her bed with a sick headache. The inspector, meanwhile, pursued the Colonel with dogged determination, and it seemed to the casual observer that a suspect had at last emerged. But Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her knitting needles clicking softly, shook her head at the simplicity of it all. Colonel Halford was brusque and quick-tempered, yes, but he was also a man of rigid honour. The quarrel might point to tension, but tension was not the same as murder. No, she thought, this case was still in its infancy, and those who rushed to judgment would soon find themselves misled. She recalled the peculiar relief in young Peter Bloxam's manner, the carefully polished grief of Penelope Harcourt, and the nervous agitation of Mrs. Ellison. All were threads in the same tangled skein. Human nature, Miss Marple knew, was rarely simple, and beneath the outward respectability of St. Mary Mead, old resentments and dangerous passions lay coiled, waiting for just the right moment to strike. In the silence of her sitting-room, the ticking of the clock steady against the shadows, Miss Marple smiled faintly. The story of Arthur Harcourt's death had only just begun, and the village had yet to realize how very many secrets lay waiting to be uncovered. The following day dawned cool and grey, a mist lingering over the meadows and softening the outlines of the cottages in St. Mary Mead. It seemed as though the very air of the village was holding its breath, waiting for the next whisper, the next revelation. People who normally went about their routines with calm regularity now paused at their gates, conversing in hushed voices, their eyes darting to the road that led to the old mill. News of the quarrel between Colonel Halford and Arthur Harcourt had spread with astonishing speed, and though no one claimed to know the full details, Everyone was quite certain that Halford had said something unforgivable, and that Harcourt had responded in kind. As always, the details shifted with each retelling, but the conclusion remained fixed. Halford must surely be guilty. At breakfast in the vicarage, Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, declared with firm conviction that she would never again invite the colonel to one of their charitable luncheons. A man capable of raising his voice to a neighbour at a garden party is quite beyond the pale. And now, with Arthur Harcourt lying dead, it is too dreadful. The vicar, who was stirring sugar into his tea, murmured that no judgment should be made until the inspector completed his inquiries. But Mrs. Weatherby, like many in the village, was not inclined toward patience. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves was pursuing his case with characteristic determination. He had summoned Colonel Halford to the police station in the nearby town for questioning, and though the colonel returned later that day, stiff-backed and furious, the impression left on the village was plain. He was a man under suspicion. "They may not have locked him up," muttered Mr. Ellis at the post office, "but they've got their eye on him. Mark my words, he won't walk free of this." Miss Marple, however, was far less convinced. That afternoon she took a quiet stroll down the lane, her knitting bag slung comfortably over her arm, and found Colonel Halford pacing outside his garden gate, his face flushed with indignation. On seeing her, he stopped short, then removed his hat with a brusque gesture. "Miss Marple, you'll have heard the village chatter by now, no doubt. Dreadful stuff, all of it. They've decided I'm guilty already, and not a shred of sense between them." Miss Marple regarded him kindly, her pale blue eyes sharp beneath the brim of her straw hat. "It is very often the way, Colonel. People do so like to have a solution quickly, and the obvious one is always the most attractive. It saves them the trouble of thinking too deeply." The Colonel gave a sharp laugh. "Obvious. That's precisely it. I did quarrel with the fellow, yes. Arthur Harcourt had a way of needling one, and I'll admit my temper is not always of the calmest. But murder? No, madam. I am many things, but I am not a murderer." "I quite believe you," Miss Marple said softly, and something in her tone seemed to relieve him more than a dozen denials to the inspector could have done. He gave her a curt nod, then muttered something about blasted gossip and stalked back inside. That evening, as the mist thickened into a fine drizzle, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire, piecing together the day's impressions. The Colonel's indignation was genuine, she felt certain, but indignation alone did not absolve a man. What troubled her more was the behavior of those who ought to have been relieved by the suspicion shifting to Halford, yet seemed curiously unsettled by it. Mrs. Ellison, for instance, had avoided being seen in public all day, and her maid was dispatched to the shops in her stead. And Penelope Harcourt, now widowed, had received a stream of callers offering condolences, yet her manner was oddly controlled, as though she were playing a part rather than living through grief. The next morning brought a development that caused the village to stir anew. A letter had been found in Arthur Harcourt's desk, half-written and never posted, addressed to a solicitor in London. It referred obliquely to a matter of grave importance, and hinted that Harcourt intended to take decisive action regarding an intolerable situation. Inspector Graves produced it with no small satisfaction, convinced it pointed to a blackmail scheme or financial impropriety. But the phrasing was vague, and to Miss Marple's mind peculiarly personal in tone rather than strictly businesslike. She mentioned this delicately to the inspector when she encountered him outside the inn. "It struck me, Inspector, that Mr. Harcourt's letter spoke more of emotion than of finance. I wonder if it might not be wise to consider other sorts of entanglements." Inspector Graves pursed his lips. "I dare say you mean women, Miss Marple." "Well, we've looked into that, and there's no evidence yet." He tapped his notebook. "I'm more inclined to believe it's about money. Debts. That's the usual story." Miss Marple inclined her head, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "The usual story, yes, but human beings are not often usual, Inspector. They are most inconveniently peculiar. That same afternoon, Mrs. Ellison was seen walking hurriedly to the vicarage, her veil drawn low, and though no one knew precisely what passed between her and the vicar's wife, by evening half the village was whispering that she had confessed to some terrible knowledge. Mrs. Price, standing at her gate with folded arms, swore that Mrs. Ellison had been in tears, while young Tommy Calthorpe declared he had overheard the word scandal muttered more than once. Miss Marple, who had herself observed Mrs. Ellison's hurried steps and the way her hands trembled as she clutched her prayer book, considered carefully. Mrs. Ellison had always been a nervous sort, prone to gossip yet terrified of being gossiped about. That she should be connected, however indirectly, to Arthur Harcourt's death suggested that more secrets were concealed beneath the village's polished surface. That night, when most of St. Mary Mead had gone to bed, Miss Marple remained wakeful, her mind turning over each fragment of knowledge she had gathered. The colonel's quarrel, the unfinished letter, the maid's testimony, Mrs. Ellison's agitation, and Penelope Harcourt's carefully managed grief. All of it formed a pattern, though one not yet complete. It was like a piece of embroidery left unfinished. The outlines were there, but the full picture had yet to emerge. She thought of the stories she had witnessed in her long life, neighbors who poisoned one another over property disputes, cousins who lied for love, and respectable men who ruined themselves for pride. This case, she suspected, was no different. Somewhere in the midst of all these whispered quarrels and polished facades lay the truth. And when that truth showed itself, it would reveal motives far older and deeper than any financial trouble could suggest. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her knitting resting neatly beside her, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. She was patient. Human nature always betrayed itself in time. And in the village of St. Mary Mead, beneath the mist and gossip, human nature was already beginning to crack. The morning after Mrs. Ellison's mysterious visit to the vicarage, the village awoke to yet another layer of intrigue. The mist had lifted, and with the clearer weather came sharper tongues. Word spread quickly that the vicar's wife had looked pale and strained at early service, though she said nothing of substance. To those gathered in the pews, it was evidence enough that something troubling had been confided. By the time parishioners spilled into the churchyard, whispers grew that Mrs. Ellison had revealed some scandal involving Arthur Harcourt. None could say precisely what, but the certainty of scandal was enough to give the villagers fresh fuel for speculation. Miss Marple, who had attended the service as she always did, observed the flow of gossip without comment. Her delicate frame and quiet demeanor gave her the appearance of one more interested in her prayer book than the excited conversations around her, yet her mind was busy sorting through what she had seen. Mrs. Ellison herself had not appeared, which was telling, for a woman of her sensibilities was unlikely to miss church unless some strong reason kept her away. That, combined with her agitation of the previous day, suggested she carried a burden heavier than idle nerves. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, knitting needles clicking softly as she pretended to adjust a dropped stitch. The colonel stood a little apart, his manner stiff and defensive as he endured pointed glances from his neighbors. He had not bowed his head during the prayers with the customary ease, but rather with the rigidity of a man performing a duty beneath watchful eyes. His glance, however, strayed more than once toward Mrs. Ellison's empty seat inside, and this Miss Marple did not miss. Later that day, Inspector Graves made a formal announcement at the old mill. The coroner's inquest would be held in 2 days' time. The villagers received this news with an air of satisfaction. An inquest promised drama, revelations, and the chance for everyone's private theories to be tested in public. Mrs. Price declared she would sit in the very front row if she had to queue all morning for a seat, while Mrs. Calthorpe confided that she had already set aside a particularly somber black hat for the occasion. At the old mill, Meanwhile, Penelope Harcourt received visitors with the grace of a hostess rather than the grief of a widow. She thanked neighbors for their condolences, spoke with calm dignity of her husband's virtues, and hinted gently at her own uncertain future. Some remarked on her composure as admirable. Others, like Mrs. Price, whispered that no proper wife would appear so serene so soon after such a loss. Miss Marple, when she called briefly with a basket of scones, found her smiling faintly as she arranged lilies in a vase. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "it must be most trying with everyone watching and wondering so." Mrs. Harcourt inclined her head gracefully. "One must do one's best to behave with dignity, Miss Marple. My husband would not have wished for hysterics." "Very true," Miss Marple agreed, though she could not help but recall other widows she had known. The absence of visible distress was not in itself suspicious, but the calculated serenity of Mrs. Harcourt suggested to Miss Marple a woman whose mind was fixed more on appearances than on loss. It was, she reflected, the sort of composure often maintained by those with something to guard. That evening, a new twist arose. Peter Bloxham, who had been seen little since the day of the murder, was spotted riding swiftly out of the village on horseback, his expression grim. A curious villager noted he carried a satchel, and speculation bloomed at once that he might be fleeing. By dusk, it was firmly believed in several households that the young man had quarrelled with Harcourt over money, or perhaps over a woman, and now, with suspicion falling on the colonel, he had taken advantage of the distraction to escape. Miss Marple, hearing of this at her own gate, merely shook her head. "Young men are often impetuous," she remarked. "It does not always signify guilt. Sometimes it signifies fear of being thought guilty, which is a different matter altogether." She spent that evening reviewing the threads of the case in her mind. The colonel's quarrel, Penelope's composure, Mrs. Ellison's secrecy, the maid's testimony, and now Peter's sudden departure, all formed a puzzle in which several pieces seemed to fit, yet the overall picture was still obscured. The unfinished letter in Harcourt's desk remained a particularly stubborn clue. Its vagueness suggested deliberate concealment, as though he had wished to confide something without putting the whole truth to paper. Such half-confidences were dangerous things, often written by men who believed they held the upper hand, and who were later proved wrong. The next day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicar's wife, under the pretense of delivering a recipe for lemon sponge. Mrs. Weatherby looked pale and tired, her manner unusually restrained. Over tea, Miss Marple let the conversation drift gently, until the subject of Mrs. Ellison arose. She was quite distraught, Mrs. Weatherby admitted at last, lowering her voice. She came here in a state, insisting she could not bear the weight of what she knew. I urged her to confide in the inspector, but she seemed terrified of being dragged into scandal. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Scandal can be more frightening than crime itself, in a village such as ours. Did she perhaps speak of the nature of this burden? Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, then shook her head. Not directly. Only that she feared something dreadful would come out. And, well, she said Arthur Harcourt had held power over her in a way. But I pressed no further. One must respect confidences. Miss Marple nodded gently. She had no intention of betraying Mrs. Ellison's secret, but the mere outline was enough to sharpen her suspicions. Arthur Harcourt, it seemed, had not only quarrelled with the colonel, but had also exerted some private influence over Mrs. Ellison. That hinted at knowledge or leverage of a personal nature. Combined with the unfinished letter, the pattern was becoming clearer. Harcourt had known something about the people around him, and he had intended to use it. That evening, as dusk settled and lamps glowed warm in cottage windows, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. She reflected on the delicate balance of village life, appearances preserved, reputations guarded, secrets hidden beneath layers of courtesy. Arthur Harcourt had disrupted that balance, perhaps too recklessly, and when balance was disturbed, Someone always paid the price, for now suspicion rested squarely on Colonel Halford. The villagers were content with their theory, and the inspector seemed satisfied with the case's direction. Yet Miss Marple, with the quiet certainty born of long observation, felt the truth was yet far from the surface. There were deeper motives waiting to be uncovered, and more than one person in St. Mary Mead had reason to wish Arthur Harcourt out of the way. As the clock ticked softly in the corner, she laid down her knitting and folded her hands. The inquest would soon be held, and with it new revelations would surely emerge. Miss Marple, patient as ever, was content to wait. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself at precisely the moment it could no longer be hidden. And in the matter of the old mill, that moment was drawing steadily nearer. The day of the inquest dawned bright, with a chill in the air that seemed to sharpen every voice and glance in St. Mary Mead. The small town hall, usually reserved for parish meetings and harvest fetes, was filled to capacity. Benches creaked beneath the weight of villagers eager for a spectacle, their whispers echoing against the wooden walls. Even those who professed distaste for morbid curiosity had found themselves unable to resist the chance to witness the proceedings. For here at last facts would be laid bare, or so they believed. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the back, was as composed as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She listened to the buzz around her with the same attention she might have given a sermon, though unlike her neighbors, she was less interested in the drama than in the subtler truths that human behavior often revealed under strain. She noted who leaned forward with excitement, who sat back in discomfort, and who avoided meeting the eyes of others. These small details, to her mind, were more illuminating than the formal words that would be spoken. The coroner, a solemn man with a grave expression, began with the doctor's report. Arthur Harcourt had died instantly from a broken neck. The angle of the injury, coupled with bruising along the shoulders, suggested force inconsistent with a simple stumble. There was no doubt. His death was caused by violence. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Inspector Graves rose, eager to present his evidence. He outlined the quarrel overheard by the maid, Alice, and recounted her testimony that she had heard Mr. Harcourt call out the Colonel's name. He reminded the jury of the Colonel's quick temper and the visible tension between the two men. It was, he insisted, a case of opportunity and motive combined. Arthur Harcourt, the inspector declared, was pushed to his death in a fit of temper by Colonel Halford. The evidence points squarely in that direction. Colonel Halford was called to speak, and he strode to the front with a military stiffness that was both proud and defensive. He admitted the quarrel, but denied any involvement in Harcourt's death. His voice rang out firmly as he spoke of honor, of the folly of sudden temper being mistaken for murderous intent. Yet even as he spoke, Miss Marple saw the tightening of Mrs. Ellison's hands in her lap, and the downward flicker of Penelope Harcourt's eyes. The villagers listened intently, but the Colonel's indignation did little to sway their belief that anger had turned deadly. Then came the turn of Mrs. Harcourt. Her composure was striking. She stood with poise, her veil drawn modestly, and spoke in a voice clear but weighted with sorrow. She described her husband's mood that day as unusually tense, though she offered no speculation as to why. She admitted that he had excused himself to retrieve a paper from his study, but professed ignorance of any quarrel beyond what the maid reported. Her performance was impeccable, yet to Miss Marple's trained ear it carried the rhythm of rehearsal. The pauses were too deliberate, the sorrow too carefully measured. Finally, Mrs. Ellison was called. Pale and trembling, she approached the front, her eyes darting nervously about the room. Her voice wavered as she admitted that Arthur Harcourt had held some kind of knowledge about her, something she dreaded becoming public. It was not criminal, nothing like that, she insisted tearfully, but it would have ruined my peace, destroyed my reputation. The room rustled with excitement, but she would say no more. Miss Marple noticed how the Colonel's jaw tightened as Mrs. Ellison spoke, as though he longed to protect her but dared not intervene. When the inquest adjourned for deliberation, the villagers spilled out into the square, their tongues wagging faster than ever. To most, the matter seemed plain. The colonel had quarrelled with Harcourt. Harcourt had threatened Mrs. Ellison with exposure of some private matter, and in the heat of passion, the colonel had silenced him forever. The coroner's verdict, returned not long after, was that Arthur Harcourt had met his death by unlawful violence inflicted by person or persons unknown. It was a cautious phrasing, yet in the minds of the villagers, the conclusion was obvious. The colonel was guilty. Miss Marple, however, walked home with a thoughtful frown. She could not accept the neatness of the villagers' judgment. Quarrels, yes. Secrets, certainly. But violence? The colonel was a man of temper, but also of rigid code. To push a man to his death in a moment of rage was possible, but not probable. Not for a man who lived by discipline. No, Miss Marple thought, the truth was subtler. The quarrel was real, but it was also convenient. Too convenient. That evening she sat in her parlour, the lamplight falling softly across her knitting, and turned over each piece of evidence in her mind. Arthur Harcourt had threatened exposure of some kind, of Mrs. Ellison's secret perhaps, or of another's. His unfinished letter hinted at decisive action, suggesting he intended to use what he knew. Yet why had Penelope Harcourt remained so calm, almost detached? Why had young Peter fled so suddenly? Why did Mrs. Ellison tremble at the very mention of her connection to Harcourt? She thought, too, of Alice the maid, whose nervous testimony had been so eagerly seized upon. Alice had heard raised voices, yes, but how much of what followed had been interpretation rather than fact? Miss Marple knew well how servants often embroidered their tales, sometimes out of fear, sometimes to appear important, and yet within the embroidery a true thread often lay hidden. The village settled uneasily after the inquest, but Miss Marple felt the air was charged with something unresolved, like the hush before a storm. The colonel had been all but condemned in popular opinion, yet her instincts told her he was not the true danger. Somewhere in the tangle of whispered scandals and carefully preserved appearances lay the hand that had pushed Arthur Harcourt to his death. The question was not whether he had been murdered, but by whom and why at that precise moment. As the clock chimed softly in her sitting room, Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked into the fire. "It will come out," she murmured to herself. "It always does. People cannot help but betray themselves if one only waits." And so she waited, with patience born of years of quiet observation, knowing that the next small crack in the village's composure would bring her closer to the truth. For though the villagers thought the inquest the end of the matter, Miss Marple knew it was only the beginning. The village of St. Mary Mead did not settle easily after the inquest, no matter how much the inspector wished it so. To the majority, the verdict had confirmed what they already believed. Colonel Halford was guilty, even if the law had been unwilling to put his name to the act. Neighbours who had once greeted him with cordiality now crossed the street to avoid his gaze, while shopkeepers served him with an air of grim duty rather than friendliness. His isolation was as complete as if he had been formally charged. Yet to Miss Marple, this swift verdict of popular opinion was precisely what troubled her most. Human nature, she knew, was inclined to grasp at the obvious, but the obvious was often a mask designed to protect the truth. She thought of Mrs. Ellison, who had looked as though the ground might swallow her whole when she admitted to Harcourt's hold over her. The colonel's protectiveness, his glance in her direction at the inquest, had not gone unnoticed. It seemed clear that Halford had quarrelled with Harcourt on her account, yet whether that quarrel had ended in violence was quite another matter. To Miss Marple, it seemed far more likely that someone else had seized upon the quarrel as a shield, behind which to conceal their own guilt. The day after the inquest, Miss Marple went to call upon Mrs. Ellison under the gentle pretext of concern for her health. The poor woman looked haggard, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling as she poured tea. She insisted she was quite well, yet her movements betrayed the tension in her body. "It is all such a dreadful business," she said, her voice breaking. "I only wish I had never said a word." "You spoke bravely," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly as she began a new row of her knitting. "And sometimes the truth, even in fragments, is necessary. Though I wonder, my dear, if Arthur Harcourt had knowledge of others as well as yourself. A man does not write such a letter, hinting at decisive action without holding more than one card in his hand." Mrs. Ellison paled, clutching her cup so tightly that Miss Marple feared it might crack. She did not speak, but her silence was as telling as any confession. Miss Marple let the matter rest, speaking instead of flowers and church bazaars, until her hostess's colour returned. But as she walked home, she was more convinced than ever that Arthur Harcourt had not confined his threats to a single person. He had been playing a dangerous game, pressing upon the weaknesses of those around him, and one of them had resolved to silence him. That same evening, another ripple disturbed the village. Peter Bloxham returned abruptly, his horse lathered from hard riding. His reappearance was greeted with suspicion rather than relief. Villagers muttered that only a guilty man would flee, and then return when he believed suspicion safely fixed elsewhere. Inspector Graves wasted no time in summoning him to answer questions, and though Peter declared hotly that he had merely gone to see a solicitor about a personal matter, his explanations were vague and unsatisfying. He looked strained, his youthful arrogance dimmed by fear. Miss Marple, who saw him pass her garden gate with a pale face and restless eyes, thought him more frightened than defiant. Fear was not proof of guilt, she reminded herself, but fear always pointed to knowledge. Over the next days, Miss Marple observed the shifting currents of suspicion with quiet patience. Mrs. Harcourt received visitors with an air of serene endurance, her composure unshaken, even as whispers about her husband's debts and possible indiscretions grew louder. She seemed almost to thrive on the attention, her black garments lending her a dignity that impressed some and unsettled others. To Miss Marple, her composure was one of the most puzzling elements of the affair. Grief could take many forms, but the widow's carefully staged sorrow had the quality of a mask too often adjusted. It was during one such visit that Miss Marple noticed something curious. As Mrs. Harcourt poured tea, her sleeve slipped back slightly, revealing a faint scratch along her wrist. It was small, almost insignificant, yet it caught Miss Marple's eye. A scratch might come from many things, gardening, a pet, but in the context of a violent struggle, even the smallest mark could tell a story. Miss Marple made no comment, but her mind filed it carefully among the other fragments she was gathering. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves continued to pursue Colonel Halford with single-minded determination. He spoke confidently in the village that an arrest was imminent, that once certain financial records were confirmed, motive and means would align. The villagers nodded eagerly, content to let suspicion rest where it suited their expectations. But Miss Marple knew too well that when everyone agreed too quickly, the truth was often something quite different. One afternoon, she visited Alice, the maid, under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. The girl, eager for company, spoke freely, her nerves loosening under Miss Marple's kind attention. "I can't get it out of my head, ma'am," she confessed. "That voice, the way he said Halford, it was angry, like he meant to shame him. But then I thought I heard another sound, too, like someone else there, but quieter. I wasn't sure, so I didn't say." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled gently. "It is often the little things we hesitate to mention that prove most useful, my dear. Always trust your memory. A quarrel may have more than one listener, or even more than one participant." As she walked home, Miss Marple felt the pieces shift closer into place. Harcourt had quarrelled with Halford, yes, but someone else had been present or lurking nearby. Someone who had used that quarrel as cover, knowing suspicion would fall naturally on the Colonel. The unfinished letter, the widow's composure, Mrs. Ellison's secret, Peter's fear, all pointed to Harcourt's habit of meddling where he should not, and now he had paid for it with his life. That evening, as the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. The village believed the matter settled. The inspector prepared to close his net around Colonel Halford, and yet she felt the true culprit had not even been seriously considered. It was always so. Appearances deceived, tempers misled, but in the end, it was the small overlooked details that revealed the truth. And she, Miss Jane Marple, had learned long ago that human nature could never keep its secrets forever. Somewhere among her neighbours, someone carried the weight of a fatal push upon their conscience, and sooner than they imagined, that burden would betray them. The days that followed seemed outwardly calm, yet beneath the surface, St. Mary Mead was as restless as a kettle left just short of the boil. Colonel Halford carried himself with grim defiance, appearing at the post office and the grocer's with shoulders squared, though his neighbours greeted him with stilted courtesy. Mrs. Ellison remained largely confined to her house, her blinds half drawn, while whispers about her secret multiplied in her absence. Penelope Harcourt, meanwhile, had begun to assume a curious position in village life. Her widow's weeds gave her an air of solemn dignity, and yet there was something almost triumphant in her bearing, as though she relished the attention her circumstances afforded her. She walked to church with measured grace, receiving condolences with quiet gratitude, and never once allowed her voice to falter. Many remarked admiringly on her composure, though Miss Marple, who observed her keenly, thought it had the cold perfection of a performance too carefully rehearsed. It was on a mild afternoon that Miss Marple, carrying a small basket of knitting wool she had purchased in town, paused at the lane leading to the old mill. She stood for a moment, gazing at the ivy-covered house, its windows shuttered and its gates closed. It had once been a place of hospitality, filled with the chatter of guests and the clinking of teacups. Now it had the air of a stage after the curtain had fallen, the audience gone, the actors vanished, but the memory of drama still clinging to the boards. A movement caught her eye. Peter Bloxham emerging from the side gate, his expression troubled. He started at the sight of her, but quickly raised his hat with a forced smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but strained. "Out for your walk?" "Yes, my dear," she replied, her eyes resting gently upon him. "And you? You've been much occupied of late." He hesitated, then shrugged. "I've had business in town, matters to attend to, nothing of consequence." His words were brisk, but his gaze slid away from hers, and Miss Marple noticed the tension in his hands as they gripped the satchel he carried. "Young men are often pressed with responsibilities," she said mildly, as though speaking of nothing more than the weather. "And sometimes burdens are heavier when they are shared too late." Peter flushed, muttered something indistinct, and excused himself hastily. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes narrowing slightly. She was certain now that Peter knew more than he had admitted, perhaps not guilt but knowledge, and knowledge withheld could be as dangerous as any deed. The air in St. Mary Mead had grown heavy with unspoken accusations, as though the very hedgerows bent closer to listen for the truth that still eluded them. Colonel Halford bore the weight of suspicion with clenched defiance, while Mrs. Ellison wilted beneath her dread. Peter Bloxham avoided the village lanes altogether, his nervousness only feeding further whispers, and Penelope Harcourt, ever the composed widow, moved serenely among her neighbours as though untouched by grief or scandal. It was this serenity, Miss Marple reflected, that troubled her most. Grief took many forms, but Penelope's calm had the deliberate polish of a mask too often worn. It was a week after the inquest when Miss Marple, with the quiet authority that no one ever thought to question, invited a small gathering to the vicarage drawing-room. Inspector Graves was present, his scepticism plain, as were Penelope Harcourt, Mrs. Ellison, Colonel Halford, Peter Bloxham, and the maid Alice, pale and anxious. The atmosphere was tense, each person glancing at the other with wary unease. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, and spoke in her gentle, unhurried manner. "I have been thinking a great deal about poor Mr. Harcourt's death," she began. "So much has been said of tempers and quarrels, yet the simplest truths are often the ones overlooked. Mr. Harcourt, you see, was a man who enjoyed power over others. He discovered weaknesses, debts, improprieties, secrets, and he pressed upon them. But power of that kind is a dangerous thing, for sooner or later one of those pressed too hard will resist." Her eyes rested briefly on Mrs. Ellison, who lowered her gaze in shame. "He held some knowledge over you, did he not, my dear? Enough to frighten you dreadfully, though not enough to drive you to violence." Mrs. Ellison gave a small sob, but Miss Marple's tone was kind. "No, you are not the one. Your fear is genuine." She turned next to Colonel Halford. "You quarrelled with Mr. Harcourt quite publicly. He taunted you, and you responded with temper, as men often do. But a quarrel is not murder, and anger is not proof of guilt. You are a man of honour, Colonel, too rigid to strike from behind." The Colonel straightened, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Then Miss Marple's voice softened, though its edge grew keener. "What struck me most from the very first was how very composed Mrs. Harcourt remained. A wife's grief can be quiet, yes, but yours, my dear, had the precision of rehearsal. And then there was the scratch upon your wrist. So slight it might have been dismissed. Yet it was not a gardener's scratch. It was the mark of struggle. Your husband tried to restrain you, perhaps to seize a letter, perhaps to silence your protest, and in that moment you pushed him, deliberately, knowing full well the quarrel with the Colonel would cast the shadow where you wished it to fall. A stunned silence filled the room. Penelope Harcourt's serene expression faltered at last, her lips tightening, her eyes narrowing with cold fury. "You presume much, Miss Marple," she said in a low voice. "Arthur was my husband, and a cruel one," Miss Marple replied gently. "He used his knowledge to hold power even within his own house. Your composure was not born of love, but of freedom. You are not the first wife who has mistaken relief for grief. And when you pushed him, you knew exactly what you were doing. You seized the one opportunity that presented itself in the hall, with Alice just out of sight, and the Colonel's angry voice echoing in every ear. The perfect moment. Too perfect, in fact." Inspector Graves, his face flushed with surprise, rose abruptly. "Are you saying—" "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly. "Mrs. Harcourt killed her husband. Not in sudden rage, but in cold calculation, to protect herself from whatever secret he held, and to rid herself of a man who held power over too many others." Penelope's mask cracked at last. Her composure gave way to bitterness, her voice sharp. "He would have destroyed me as he destroyed so many. Do you think I should have gone on day after day subject to his threats? He deserved it." The room seemed to hold its breath. Graves stepped forward, grim now with duty, and Penelope Harcourt's fate was sealed. Later, when the others had gone, the vicar's wife pressed Miss Marple's hand with awe. "However did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking once more. "It is always the small things, my dear. A scratch on a wrist, a tone too carefully measured, a grief too well composed. Human nature reveals itself, if one only has the patience to observe." That evening St. Mary Mead exhaled its long-held breath. The villagers, though unsettled, began to return to their ordinary routines. Gossip at the post office, chatter in the grocer's, children playing in the lane. Yet an unease lingered, as though the ivy of the old mill still clutched at the memory of death. And in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting steadily, her eyes twinkling with gentle sadness. She did not rejoice in her discovery, nor in Penelope Harcourt's downfall. She reflected, as she always did, on the frailty of human nature, its pride, its fear, its desperate grasp at freedom. To others, it had been a thrilling scandal. But to her it was simply another proof of what she had always known, that beneath the polite surface of village life lay passions as deadly as any in the great cities of the world. The old mill would one day be filled again with laughter and tea and the hum of village life, but for now its shadow lay heavy, And Miss Marple, ever patient, ever observant, resumed her knitting with quiet composure, knowing well that somewhere, some day, another truth would ripen in its own time, and she would again be there to pluck it,